Black twins denied flight boarding. Pilot's phone call reverses decision. The plane door was about to close. Flight attendants counted heads, checked seat belts, and prepared for departure. That's when Captain Michael Reynolds received the call from ground operations. "Captain, we've got a situation at the gate. 2 passengers are claiming discrimination. They say they were denied boarding because they're black. Media's already getting involved." Michael closed his eyes, fatigue washing over him. After 30 years of flying, he thought he'd seen everything. He glanced at his watch. They were already running 15 minutes behind schedule. "Put them on the phone," he said, making a decision that would change several lives forever. The bright fluorescent lights of Denver International Airport seemed to mock Jamal and Jerome Washington as they stood at the gate, their matching navy blue sweaters and pressed khakis suddenly feeling like inadequate armor against the stares of other passengers boarding the flight to Atlanta. 17 years old, honor students, and traveling alone for the first time to visit their grandmother. This trip was supposed to be a milestone of independence. Instead, it had become a humiliating standoff. "I'm sorry, but your standby tickets don't guarantee seats," the gate agent, a woman in her mid-50s named Barbara Winters, repeated for the 3rd time. Her voice remained professionally pleasant, but her eyes never quite met theirs. "There are other passengers with priority." Jamal, always the more outspoken of the twins, gripped his phone tightly. "But those people," he nodded toward an older white couple who had arrived after them and were now walking down the jetway, "they just got here and had standby tickets too. We heard them tell you." Barbara's smile tightened. "They're frequent flyers with status. Now if you'll step aside, we have a flight to board." Jerome placed a steadying hand on his brother's arm, feeling the tension in Jamal's muscles. Around them, the busy terminal continued its constant flow of travelers, most oblivious to the confrontation. But not everyone. A middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair and reading glasses hanging from a beaded chain around her neck had stopped rolling her carry-on suitcase. She was watching the exchange with narrowed eyes. "Young man, I've been doing this job for 22 years, Barbara said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Don't make a scene that you'll regret." The twins' Aunt Denise had warned them about this. "Travel while black," she'd said during one of her Sunday dinners, the smell of her famous collard greens filling the kitchen. "It's not the same experience. Keep your heads up, but your voices respectful. Document everything." So when Jerome subtly positioned his phone to record the interaction, it wasn't just instinct, it was preparation. "We're not making a scene," Jerome said quietly. "We just want to know why people who checked in after us are boarding before us when we were told it was first come, first served for standby." Barbara's eyes flicked to the phone in Jerome's hand, and her demeanor shifted instantly. She reached for the desk phone. "I need to call security." The woman with the reading glasses stepped forward then. "Excuse me," she said, her voice carrying the distinct cadence of a retired teacher. "I couldn't help overhearing. I'm on that flight too, and I've been waiting here for the past hour. These young men were here before those other passengers." Barbara's hand paused over the phone. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." "I think it does," the woman replied, introducing herself as Patricia Miller. "I taught high school for 35 years, and I know when something isn't right." She turned to the twins. "When did you check in for standby?" 6 hours ago, ma'am," Jerome answered. "Our original flight was canceled, and this was the alternative they gave us." Patricia turned back to Barbara. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor, please." As Barbara reluctantly made the call, Jamal felt his phone vibrate. A text from their father. "Everything okay? Your location shows you're still at the airport." Marcus Washington sat in his home office in Chicago, surrounded by family photos and law books. At 53, he'd built a successful career as a corporate attorney, navigating predominantly white spaces with a careful balance of assertiveness and strategic accommodation. He taught his sons the same careful dance excellence as both armor and weapon. When Jerome had texted earlier about the flight cancellation and standby situation, Marcus had been concerned but not alarmed. Now an hour passed when they should have boarded, his parental radar was blaring. He dialed Jamal's number. "Dad," Jamal's voice was controlled but tight. "They're not letting us board. People who came after us are getting on." Marcus closed his eyes, his jaw clenching. "Not this, not his boys. Put me on speaker," he said, his voice dropping into what his sons called his courtroom tone. As Jamal held up the phone, a supervisor approached, a tall man with a receding hairline and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "What seems to be the problem here?" Before Barbara could speak, Marcus's voice came through the phone. "This is Marcus Washington, father of Jamal and Jerome Washington. My sons have been waiting as standby passengers for 6 hours, and they're being passed over for passengers who arrived later. I'd like an explanation." The supervisor, whose name tag read Thomas, frowned at the phone. "Sir, we have procedures for standby passengers based on multiple factors, including race," Marcus interrupted. The terminal seemed to go silent, though in reality only those nearby had heard. Thomas's face flushed. "Absolutely not. That's a serious accusation." "Then explain to me why my sons, who arrived hours ago, are watching passenger after passenger board ahead of them," Marcus continued. "And why your gate agent threatened to call security when they simply asked for an explanation." Thomas looked at Barbara, who avoided his gaze. Patricia Miller stepped forward again. "I witnessed it all. These young men have been nothing but polite." Inside the cockpit of Flight 2187, Captain Michael Reynolds listened as the twins were put on the phone. He heard the measured, articulate voices of two young men explaining the situation. How they'd been first on the standby list after their original flight was canceled. How they'd waited patiently for 6 hours. How they'd watched other standby passengers who arrived later board ahead of them. Michael had grown up in the 1970s in a small Georgia town. His father, a factory worker who never finished high school, had drilled into him a simple philosophy: judge people by their character, not their color. But Michael knew that simplistic ideal often crashed against the complex reality of American life. "This is Captain Reynolds," he said when they finished. "I understand there's a situation at the gate. Can you tell me your names again?" "Jamal and Jerome Washington, sir," came the reply, two voices almost in unison. "You're traveling to Atlanta?" "Yes, sir, to visit our grandmother. She's turning 80 this weekend." Michael made a decision. "Put the gate supervisor back on, please." When Thomas came on the line, Michael's voice left no room for argument. "Thomas, I understand we have 2 open seats in row 14. Please board the Washington brothers immediately. We're already behind schedule." There was a pause, then Thomas's stiff reply. "Captain, there are other passengers with—" "Thomas," Michael cut him off. "I'm the captain of this aircraft. Those 2 young men will be on this flight. That's not a request." 5 minutes later, Jamal and Jerome Washington walked down the jetway, their dignity intact but their innocence a little bruised. As they stepped onto the plane, the flight attendant at the door gave them a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, gentlemen. The captain would like to speak with you after we reach cruising altitude." Behind them, Patricia Miller boarded as well, giving them an encouraging nod as she passed by to her seat in first class. The seatbelt sign dinged off at 32,000 feet. The twins had spent the first 20 minutes of the flight in near silence, processing what had happened. The adrenaline that had carried them through the confrontation was wearing off, leaving behind a hollow feeling all too familiar to young black men forced to grow up too quickly. "Excuse me," a flight attendant with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair leaned toward them. "Captain Reynolds would like to see you in the galley when you have a moment." They found the captain waiting, his uniform crisp, his face lined with the experience of decades in the sky. At 58, Michael Reynolds had the weathered look of someone who had seen much of the world, both its beauty and its ugliness. "Jamal and Jerome," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming up. I wanted to check on you personally." "Thank you for intervening, sir," Jerome said as they shook hands. Michael shook his head. "I'm sorry it was necessary. That's not how passengers should be treated on my aircraft." "It happens," Jamal said, a lifetime of similar experiences in those 2 words. The captain studied them for a moment. "Are you 2 in school?" "Yes, sir," Jerome answered. "We're seniors, both applying to colleges now." "Any interest in aviation?" The question caught them by surprise. Jamal spoke first. "I've actually thought about it. Our uncle was in the Air Force." Something shifted in Michael's expression. "What's his name?" "William Taylor," Jerome said. "He flew transport planes, retired as a lieutenant colonel 5 years ago." Michael's eyes widened slightly. "Bill Taylor." "From the 908th Airlift Wing?" The twins exchanged glances. "Yes, sir," Jamal confirmed. "You know him?" Michael laughed, a genuine sound that drew smiles from nearby passengers. "Know him? He saved my life in Kuwait in '91. We were roommates at the airbase." He shook his head in disbelief. "Small world doesn't begin to cover it." As the flight continued toward Atlanta, the conversation in the galley extended well beyond the usual pilot-passenger interaction. Michael shared stories about their uncle, some the twins had never heard, and about his own journey from a small-town Georgia boy to airline captain. "The sky doesn't care what color your skin is," Michael told them. "It'll kill you just the same if you don't respect it." He paused. "Unfortunately, the same can't be said for everyone on the ground." Back in Chicago, Marcus Washington paced his office, still seething from the incident. His wife, Elaine, a pediatrician who'd faced her own battles in predominantly white medical institutions, sat watching him with concerned eyes. "The boys are on the flight," he said, stopping to look at her. "The captain intervened." Elaine nodded, relief flooding her features. "Thank God. They shouldn't need divine intervention to get on a plane they had tickets for," Marcus replied, his voice tight. Elaine rose and placed a hand on his arm. "No, they shouldn't, but they're safe. They're on their way." She hesitated. "Are you going to file a complaint?" Marcus looked at the family portrait on his desk taken last Christmas, all four of them in matching sweaters, smiling. The boys had been children then. Now at 17, they were navigating a world that would see their skin before seeing their hearts or minds, just as he had, just as his father had. "Yes," he said finally. "Not just for our boys, for all the others who don't have an attorney for a father or a phone to record the interaction." The next morning, as the sun rose over Atlanta, Jerome and Jamal sat on their grandmother's porch, sipping sweet tea and recounting their experience. Grandmother Wilma, elegant at almost 80, listened with the patient wisdom of someone who had lived through the civil rights movement and witnessed both progress and persistent prejudice. "You know," she said when they finished, "that reminds me of something that happened to your grandfather in 1962. The twins leaned forward. Their grandfather had passed before they were born, but his presence remained strong in family stories. "He was trying to catch a bus to Memphis for a job interview," Wilma continued. "The driver wouldn't let him board, said the bus was full even though it wasn't. A white man, a preacher from the local Methodist church, stood up and refused to continue his journey unless your grandfather was allowed on." She smiled at the memory. "That preacher and your grandfather became friends for life. He even officiated our wedding." "Did Grandpa get the job?" Jerome asked. "He did, worked there for 35 years. Wilma's eyes twinkled. "Sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up. Your Captain Reynolds reminds me of that preacher." Captain Michael Reynolds was thinking of the Washington Twins, too, as he prepared for his return flight to Denver. He hadn't planned to get involved in a gate dispute, but something about the measured voices of those young men on the phone had resonated with him. Perhaps it was because they reminded him of his own son, now 25 and working as an engineer in Boston. Or perhaps it was because of Bill Taylor. Kuwait, 1991. A sandstorm had grounded their transport plane. Intelligence reports warned of enemy forces in the area. Michael, then a young Air Force pilot, had wanted to attempt takeoff despite the conditions. Bill had physically blocked him from entering the cockpit. "Not today, Reynolds," Bill had said. "Not in this storm." They'd learned later that 3 planes that had attempted flight that day had crashed. No survivors. Michael pulled out his phone and after a moment's hesitation dialed a number he hadn't called in years. "This is Taylor," came the gruff response. "Bill, it's Mike Reynolds. You're not going to believe who I just met on my flight." In Denver, Barbara Winters sat in the regional manager's office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. After 32 years with the airline, her career was now balanced on a knife's edge. The regional manager, David Chen, looked up from the incident report with an expression of deep disappointment. "Barbara, the video is pretty clear. Those young men were next on the standby list. You passed them over repeatedly." "It wasn't about race," Barbara insisted, her voice breaking. "I was following protocol for our frequent flyers. The protocol clearly states that time of standby registration takes precedence over status in cases of canceled flights," David replied. "And even if there was confusion about the policy, your response when they questioned it was completely inappropriate." Barbara stared at her hands. The truth was more complicated than simple racism, at least in her mind. When she'd seen the twins approach her gate, 2 young black men in matching outfits, an old fear had stirred in her. A memory from 1989, when she'd been mugged by 2 black teenagers outside a shopping mall in Detroit. The rational part of her knew these honor students had nothing in common with those long-ago assailants except skin color, but 30 years of buried trauma had surfaced in that moment. "I need some time off," she said finally, "and perhaps some counseling." David nodded. "Both can be arranged, but Barbara, this can't happen again." That evening, Patricia Miller, the former teacher who had stood up for the twins, posted about the incident on her Facebook page. She hadn't recorded it. She was from a generation that didn't automatically document every interaction, but her detailed account struck a chord. By midnight, her post had been shared over 5,000 times. One of those shares reached Elaine Washington's feed through a mutual friend. She immediately sent the link to Marcus, who was still drafting his formal complaint to the airline. "Someone stood up for our boys," she said when he called her. "A complete stranger." Marcus read the post, emotion welling in his throat. "I want to thank her." In Atlanta, the weekend celebration for grandmother Wilma's 80th birthday was in full swing. Relatives from across the country had gathered in her backyard, where tables groaned under the weight of traditional family recipes and new culinary experiments from the younger generation. Jamal and Jerome had become minor celebrities among their cousins after their airport story spread through the family grapevine. Their younger cousins saw them as heroes who had stood up to injustice. Their older relatives recognized the familiar contours of a story that had played out countless times across generations. "So the captain actually knew Uncle Bill?" Cousin Aisha asked, wide-eyed at the coincidence. "Not just knew him," Jerome explained. "They served together in the Gulf War. Uncle Bill apparently saved his life." Across the yard, William Taylor was engaged in an animated phone conversation, occasionally glancing toward his nephews with pride. As the evening progressed, Wilma tapped her glass for attention. The family gathered around as she stood, regal in a purple dress that set off her silver hair. "I want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate with me," she began. 80 years is a long time to be breathing the Lord's air, and I'm grateful for every moment." Her gaze settled on the twins. "I'm especially thankful that all my family made it here safely, despite some unnecessary obstacles." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. "But I also want to say this," Wilma continued. "What happened to Jamal and Jerome is not new. My generation faced much worse. What gives me hope is that there are still people willing to stand up, that teacher at the airport and that pilot." She smiled. "And what gives me even more hope is seeing how my grandsons handled themselves. Dignity with intelligence, recording everything." Laughter broke out at this last part. Even Marcus, who had flown in that morning with Elaine, smiled despite his lingering anger. "So I propose a toast," Wilma raised her glass. "To justice that shouldn't need fighting for, but to the strength to fight when necessary." Glasses clinked as the family repeated, "To justice and strength." Later, as the party wound down, William approached the twins with his phone. "Boys, there's someone who wants to talk to you." He handed the phone to Jerome, who put it on speaker so Jamal could hear. "Hello, Jerome, Jamal." Captain Reynolds' voice came through clearly. "I hope your grandmother's celebration is going well." "It is, sir," Jamal replied. "Thank you again for what you did." "Actually, that's why I'm calling," Michael said. "I've been thinking about our conversation on the plane. If either of you is serious about aviation, I'd like to offer some assistance. The industry needs more diverse voices in the cockpit." The twins exchanged excited glances. Jamal had been considering engineering, but the idea of flying had taken root during their conversation with the captain. "I'm interested, sir," he said. "Excellent. I've spoken with your uncle, and we've put together some information about cadet programs. There's also a mentorship opportunity I'd like to discuss." As Michael outlined possibilities that neither twin had considered before, Marcus and Elaine joined them, listening intently. When the call ended, the family sat in thoughtful silence. "This doesn't erase what happened," Marcus said finally, "but it does show how connections can be made in unexpected ways." Elaine squeezed his hand, "And how standing up for what's right can open doors rather than close them." 2 days later, as the twins prepared to return to Chicago, they received an email from the airline's corporate office. It contained an official apology, confirmed that appropriate action had been taken regarding the gate agent, and offered them lifetime priority standby status. "Not bad," Jerome remarked as they read it together. "But not really the point, is it?" Jamal shook his head. "No, it's not about free perks. It's about being treated like everyone else in the first place." Their return flight was uneventful, but as they settled into their seats, Jamal noticed a familiar figure boarding Patricia Miller, the teacher who had spoken up for them. He nudged Jerome, who immediately recognized her too. "Ms. Miller," Jamal called out as she passed their row. She stopped, surprised, then smiled warmly when she recognized them. "Well, hello there, what a coincidence." "We wanted to thank you," Jerome said, "for standing up for us at the gate." Patricia waved away the thanks. "I only did what anyone should have done." She hesitated, then added more quietly, "My late husband was black. We were together for 43 years, and I saw how differently he was treated sometimes when we traveled separately versus together." Her eyes grew distant with memory. "He always said that silence in the face of injustice makes you complicit." A flight attendant approached. "Ma'am, we need to get everyone seated for departure." Patricia nodded. "Of course." To the twins, she added, "My seat is in 22C if you'd like to continue our conversation later." After takeoff, the twins did seek her out. They learned that Patricia had been an English teacher in Minneapolis, that she had 2 daughters and 5 grandchildren, and that her Facebook post about the incident had gone viral. "My grandson showed me," she said, somewhat bemused. "Apparently I'm trending, whatever that means at my age." When they returned to Chicago, Marcus and Elaine were waiting at the arrival gate. The family embraced, all of them changed in subtle ways by the events of the past week. "Dad," Jamal said as they walked toward the parking garage, "I've been thinking about what Captain Reynolds said about the cadet program." Marcus looked at his son, seeing not just the boy he'd raised, but the man he was becoming. "Are you serious about pursuing it?" "I am. I still want to go to college first, but after that." "Yeah." Marcus nodded slowly. "Then we'll look into it together." 3 months later, Barbara Winters sat across from Michael Reynolds in a quiet corner of the airport staff cafeteria. She had reached out through company channels, asking to meet the captain who had overruled her decision that day. After weeks of counseling and reflection, she wanted to make amends not for the airline's PR, but for her own healing. "Thank you for agreeing to see me," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. Michael studied her thoughtfully. "I was curious about your request." Barbara took a deep breath. "I wanted to apologize and to explain, not to excuse what I did, but to understand it myself." She told him about the 1989 incident, the buried trauma, the automatic fear response that had influenced her behavior at the gate. "I've spent my whole life thinking I wasn't prejudiced," she concluded. "But that day showed me that I was carrying something ugly inside. Something I needed to face." Michael was silent for a long moment. "We all carry things," he said finally. "The question is whether we're willing to examine them honestly." He paused. "Have you reached out to the Washington twins?" Barbara shook her head. "I wasn't sure if that would be welcome." "It might not be," Michael acknowledged, "but healing sometimes requires courage on all sides." A week later, with Michael's encouragement, Barbara sent a handwritten letter to the Washington family. She didn't ask for forgiveness or try to justify her actions. She simply acknowledged the harm she had caused, explained the work she was doing to address her own biases, and thanked them for the wake-up call that had forced her to confront her past. Marcus read the letter first, his attorney's mind analyzing it for sincerity versus liability management. Finding it genuine, he shared it with Elaine and the twins during Sunday dinner. "What do you think?" he asked after they had all read it. Jerome considered the question carefully. "I think it took guts to write this." Jamal nodded in agreement. "Yeah, it doesn't fix what happened, but it's something." Elaine watched her sons with pride. "Do you want to respond?" The twins exchanged one of their silent communications that had mystified their parents since childhood. "Yes," they said in unison. Their reply was brief but meaningful. They thanked Barbara for her honesty, shared that they too were on a journey of growth, and wished her well in her continued self-examination. They closed with a quote from their grandmother Wilma. "Healing happens when truth is spoken and heard." 6 months after the incident, Jamal Washington stood in the cockpit of a small Cessna training aircraft, Captain Michael Reynolds beside him in the co-pilot's seat. Through the mentorship program that Michael had helped establish, Jamal was taking his first flying lesson. "Ready?" Michael asked. Jamal's hands were steady on the controls as he nodded. "Ready." As the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the clear blue sky, Jamal felt a sense of freedom unlike anything he'd experienced before. Up here, as Captain Reynolds had said, the sky didn't care about the color of his skin. Up here, what mattered was skill, knowledge, and respect for the elements. Jerome had chosen a different path, pursuing his interest in law and social justice, inspired partly by their father and partly by their airport experience. The twins remained as close as ever, but they were discovering their individual passions and purposes. Back on the ground after the exhilarating first flight, Jamal checked his phone to find a text from Jerome. "How was it?" He sent back a single word: freedom. That evening at the Washington home, the family gathered for dinner with special guests, William Taylor and Michael Reynolds, whose renewed friendship had become a positive outcome of the troubling incident. "To think," William mused, "if you hadn't been the captain on that flight or if the boys hadn't mentioned me." "Coincidence or something more?" Elaine suggested with a smile. Michael shook his head. "I don't believe in coincidences anymore, not after Kuwait and certainly not after meeting these young men." Marcus raised his glass. "To connections we didn't know existed." As they clinked glasses, the doorbell rang. Marcus went to answer it and returned with an unexpected visitor, Patricia Miller, who had been invited after the family had finally connected with her through social media. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, suddenly unsure despite the invitation. "Not at all," Elaine assured her, taking her coat. "We've been wanting to thank you in person." The expanded dinner party flowed naturally, conversation moving from serious discussions about ongoing efforts to address discrimination in the airline industry to lighter topics and shared laughter. Patricia shared stories about teaching high school in the 1980s, William regaled them with sanitized military tales, and Michael talked about the changes he'd seen in aviation over 3 decades. As dessert was served, Jamal cleared his throat. "I have some news," he announced. "I've been accepted into the airline's cadet program after I graduate next year." Congratulations erupted around the table. Marcus squeezed his son's shoulder, eyes shining with pride. "There's something powerful about coming full circle," Michael observed. "From being denied boarding to potentially becoming the one who welcomes others aboard." "It's more than full circle," Jerome added thoughtfully. "It's a spiral upward. Taking a negative experience and using it to climb higher to change things from within." Patricia smiled at the young man's insight. "That's beautifully put." Later, as the evening wound down, the guests prepared to depart. At the door, Patricia turned to the twins. "I've been teaching for over 3 decades, and I've learned that education happens everywhere, not just in classrooms. What you experienced and how you responded to it, that's education in its purest form." After everyone had left, the Washington family sat together in their living room, processing the evening. "It's strange," Elaine mused. "That terrible day at the airport has led to all these new connections, new opportunities." "That's often how change happens," Marcus replied. "Not in grand gestures, but in individual moments of courage or failure and what we choose to build from them." Jamal thought about his first flight earlier that day, the feeling of the aircraft responding to his touch, the earth falling away below. "I never would have discovered flying if this hadn't happened." Jerome nodded. "And I might not have gotten so interested in civil rights law." Marcus looked at his sons, no longer boys, but young men shaped by both the injustices they'd faced and the unexpected allies they'd found. "You know what your grandmother would say about all this?" The twins smiled. "God works in mysterious ways," they quoted in unison. "Exactly," Marcus said. "Though I'd add that humans have to do their part too. Captain Reynolds could have ignored the situation. Ms. Miller could have minded her own business. You two could have backed down. I could have accepted the airline's first apology without pushing for systemic change. But none of us did," Elaine pointed out. "And that's why this story doesn't end at that gate." 1 year later, as Jamal prepared for his high school graduation and his entry into the cadet program, and Jerome readied himself for pre-law studies at Howard University, a letter arrived from the airline's corporate headquarters. The company was implementing a new training program for all customer-facing staff, focused on recognizing and addressing implicit bias. The program had been developed with input from civil rights organizations and affected passengers, including Marcus Washington, who had been invited to serve on an advisory board. The letter mentioned that the training would include a case study based on the twins' experience with their permission. "What do you think?" Marcus asked his sons after sharing the letter. Jerome and Jamal exchanged glances. "I think," Jerome said slowly, "that our story might help change how other people are treated." Jamal nodded. "And that's worth more than any apology or compensation." As the Washington family celebrated the twins' graduation that spring, their extended circle had grown to include Michael Reynolds, William Taylor, and Patricia Miller, connections forged in a moment of injustice, but strengthened by a shared commitment to doing better. And when Jamal boarded his first flight as a cadet trainee, he carried with him not just the memory of being denied boarding, but also the knowledge that one person's decision to do the right thing could change the trajectory of many lives. In the cockpit, strapping into the jump seat, he exchanged a nod with the captain, not Michael this time, but another veteran pilot who had heard the story. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Washington," the captain said. "We've been expecting you." If you've enjoyed this powerful story about connection and standing up for what's right, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear about a time when someone stood up for you, or when you stood up for someone else.